Hello, everybody, and welcome both to our online audience and our very restricted COVID audience here at Glover Cottages in Sydney. It's COVID that's the subject of our discussion tonight. Our speaker, Adjunct Professor Bill Botel, has for many decades been an expert advisor on health issues after an earlier career as a diplomat. Over the past year, Bill has made lively, thoughtful, and above all, accurate recommendations for public policy in dealing with this scourge. Bill's going to speak for half an hour, and following that, we'll have half an hour for discussions. For those of you online, please use your Zoom question and answer function to put your questions at any time during Bill's talk or in the discussion period. For those of you here in the hall, just indicate that you'd like to ask a question and it'll be all systems go. But that's enough of housekeeping. Ladies and gentlemen, Bill Botel.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Ian. We have a 40-year collaboration from our time in foreign affairs, so it's lovely to be here and to be welcomed by you and the people here at AIIA, and to talk about COVID. My own history in this, I'll just briefly say, is that when I was in foreign affairs with Ian in 1983, the Hawke government was elected in Canberra, and I was asked by the then Health Minister, Dr. Neil Blewett, to come and be his Chief of Staff, Senior Private Secretary, to deal with the big political issue of those days, which was the introduction of the Medicare National Health Insurance Scheme, which was the responsibility of Dr. Blewett. And I came out of foreign affairs as a diplomat to Neil to assist him in that very worthwhile endeavour, a key central plank of the Hawke Labor government's election policy and very important then and since. However, in that March 83, little did Dr. Blewett know, or me even less, that in October of 82 in Sydney, Professor Ron Penny, a very eminent scientist, had reported the first case of a mystery disease. Nobody knew what caused this disease, but from October 82 into 83, more and more young men, particularly in Sydney, young gay men, were turning up in the final stages of painful infection and were dying. And this was being reported around the world. So at the same time, Dr. Blewett had the responsibility of implementing the Medicare system. He was confronted with an extraordinary threat to public health in Australia and around the world. Now, in those days, as extraordinary as it seems now, it took years, almost, certainly months, to understand what the infective agent was. Scientists had no idea, yet we had an increasing number of young people who were infected and dying in Sydney and around the world. And this led to a remarkable chapter in Australian public health policy making, having to deal with what eventually became identified as a viral problem that was already in Australia, for which there was no cure, no vaccine, no treatment, yet it was spreading at an alarming rate through 83 and 1984. And the question was how to respond to that. As I said, we had no care, we had no treatment. All we could do was care for the dying and for the ill, but the problem was getting worse and not better. So from a standing start, as it were, with the virus already in Australia and already around the world, it fell to Dr. Blewett and to the Parliament of Australia at that time to come up with a rules of engagement for dealing with this viral disease. And I'm happy to say, in retrospect, that over that period, the Australian government, supported by the then opposition and the Parliament, adopted a very comprehensive set of policies to dealing with care and treatment and research into this new infective agent, this malady, but very importantly understood the importance of prevention. And I know it sounds obvious now at this distance that, well, why wouldn't you talk about prevention? But I can tell you at the time, it was a very novel idea that by preventing, that we could prevent the spread of the virus. And the way in which we had to prevent that spread was through changing people's behaviour. And that meant being honest and open about the nature of transmission, sexual transmission between gay men in particular, but also by injecting drug users who might be sharing needles, or in other parts of the world by sex workers where condoms weren't being used, and by a whole raft of sterilisation and other measures for people who were acquiring the disease by infected blood delivered through transfusions and reused tubes and or medical equipment and so on. All of this had to be worked out in extreme circumstances. But nevertheless, bit by bit, care, treatment, research and prevention became the basis of the Australian response. This was not the case in the rest of the world, but it was the case in Australia. And Dr. Blewett, together with Peter Boehm, who is the Liberal opposition spokesman for health, came to a very clear understanding about one way in which we should tackle it in Australia. And that was to take the politics, the party politics out of the response. We knew that there was a very serious apprehension when it came to the people who are most at risk of getting the disease, gay men, sex workers, injecting drug users and so on, typically marginalised in society. Their actions and behaviours were not popularly accepted, I guess you'd say. But nevertheless, we had to have their trust and support if we were going to persuade people to change behaviours. So Neil and Peter Boehm took to the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition in those days, Bob Hawke and Andrew Peacock, and to the Parliament more broadly, the very sensible idea that we would not allow this to become a matter of party political debate. It would be hard enough to deal with it as it was. It wasn't going to go away anytime soon. And the responses had to be generated and delivered with the support of the Australian people and not subject to, as far as could be worked out, pointless political argy-bargy that would take the politics out of the response to the pandemic. And that's how it worked in the 1980s and subsequently, even with the most extravagantly radical responses that we came up with, we trusted the communities most close to the problem. We trusted the researchers and the scientists. We looked at the science and the facts and developed policies based on those facts. Very importantly, then, as in relation to COVID, we understood that behavioural change was imperative. As I said, we had no treatment, we had no vaccine, we had no cure. People had to change their behaviours. And from the mid-1980s onwards, persuaded gay men to use condoms, sex. Condoms were used by sex workers, and we implemented clean needle and syringes for injecting drug users, the harm minimisation approach. Every one of these major steps was supported by the Commonwealth, state and territory governments of the day. There was one exception in those days, which was Queensland, but once that government disappeared, the Bjelke-Petersen government, they came online as well. And we implemented the behavioural change with the support and understanding of the Australian people, which was critical. So we based our response on trust and truth and telling people what was at issue, and the behavioural change had to be implemented and sustained if we were to reduce new HIV infection rates until better days could come along. And after about the late 1990s, better days did come along. The first really good treatments came to us from science a decade or more after the problem had arrived. But that really started to change the profile of HIV in Australia. Treatments meant that over time, people were not going to die from HIV infection, that there was a treatment that would keep them alive indefinitely, as with anybody else, but it was a slow and gradual change. The rest of the world finally understood this, I think, and by the early 2000s, that with treatments available, then there was a sea change in America and in the international community. The Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB and Malaria was created, thanks to the intervention of Nelson Mandela, Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, President Bush at the time, and a way in which the treatments that were available and changing the lives of people with HIV in the rich world so dramatically could be taken to the rest of the world as well, and the treatments could be made available at scale to bring under control what was becoming a shocking pandemic, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. It was getting better in the developed world, but it was out of control in the developing world. And when we now look at COVID and the death toll, which is shocking, 3 million people, but let's remember that since HIV came along, over 35 million people have lost their lives to HIV. A dreadful calamity. And we've really struggled and worked mightily over decades now to bring the new caseload down, the death rate down, thankfully with treatments, to get everybody on treatment that needs to be on treatment, and to do something to bring the pandemic under control, the HIV pandemic. I learned a lot from those years. It was a shocking time, but also tremendously creative in terms of national, international policy making. And bit by bit, we could see that when the affected communities got together with governments and with the scientists and the doctors and argued out everything from access to stigma and discrimination, that we could make a real change in the way the world worked in relation to HIV and in Australia. It was then, and it has been, a remarkable public health response based on trust, based on honesty, and based on bringing everybody involved, from the scientists and the doctors and the politicians, but most importantly, the people who live with the disease and most at risk of getting it, bringing them all into the public policy making and doing what they say and what they think is best to bring this under control. Now, I then, over the years, I helped the Global Fund and advocated for the Global Fund and so on, but it seemed to me that things were getting better rather than worse. The viruses were, of course, they come incessantly. Viruses are just particles of DNA. They're neither alive nor dead. They are part and parcel of life on Earth, and they move from animals to humans ceaselessly and relentlessly. Almost none of them make any difference, and they perish if a virus can be held to perish. But every so often one of them comes along and is very good at doing what viruses do, which is replicating. They exist to replicate, and they replicate to exist. And in doing so, they become incredibly disruptive if they get a hold in a cell to that cell. That's what causes what looks like an infection. And if they come from animal species into the human population that is unprepared to resist them, unable to resist them, every so often one of them really makes a problem. We saw that with HIV, which came from simian populations in Africa and was transmitted in the blood supply. But if you look over the last 10, 20, 30 years, as people understood that viruses could do this damage, we've had endless, well, not endless, but many crossovers, Zika, SARS-1, Hendra virus. It comes all the time. But the world seemed to get better at dealing with them. Through the WHO, there was good surveillance. The Americans developed a pandemic response capacity. Many countries did develop that pandemic response capacity so that if these things emerged, they were detected much more quickly than they were in the days of HIV. They were understood, the virus was contained, and even the most remarkably effective, infective viruses like Ebola in West Africa, when there were problems in Liberia and elsewhere, they were dealt with. And it very instructive in West Africa, when there was the last Ebola outbreak, there was a great degree of people coming in moon suits and trying to segregate the people of Monrovia, or I think wherever the Ebola was. And this approach was silly, but what worked was when the people closest to the epidemic understood what was at stake, they themselves organised effectively to see off Ebola. So even a very infective agent like Ebola could be contained. So from my point of view as a lay observer, this seemed like a very good idea. We'd learnt the lessons and that we could deal with this thing. However, unfortunately, when COVID emerged in China in 2019, at the end of 2019, it was as if HIV and the response to the viral outbreak since then had never existed. We came back in full circle, particularly at the level of the American administration, to the politicization of the emergence of the virus. An enormous amount of harm was done in the 1980s by the Reagan administration, who in those days politicized the emergence of HIV, tried to say that it was God's punishment for homosexuality, for sin, for depravity, for sex work, you name it. God had decided to use the virus to punish this. And that meant in practice, I mean, it was crazy, but in practical terms, it meant they never accepted that prevention could work. Because to accept that prevention could work meant that you had to accept that gay people existed, had to have condoms, or sex workers, injecting drug users had to have clean needles and so on, and this was not possible. So we had a shocking moment then, and that unfortunately was repeated in 2019. Administrations that understood how to respond to viral pandemics had gone. The Obama administration had a very good structure for dealing with it and was replaced by an administration that made even the Reagan administration look good when it came to responding to viral pandemics. I was shocked by that this could happen again, that we could be heading so quickly down the path of politicising the emergence of a virus. The only way that viruses are an expression of the iron laws of the universe, the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology, as Tom Friedman, a New York Times correspondent, so aptly said, physics, chemistry, biology, and to which I'd add mathematics. They are the ineluctable iron laws of the universe. You cannot respond to a virus politically. A virus doesn't exist to figure out if you've been naughty or nice, or if you're tall or short, or infect you if you're only voting one way and not the other, or you come from China or Monrovia or Australia or anything else. The viruses exist to replicate. There is no political response possible. You can't negotiate with a virus. You can't wish it away. But if you move quickly, really quickly, and stomp on it before it becomes a problem and gets out into the wider world, you have a chance. So what was lost in 2019 in the attempt to politicise the emergence of the virus by the previous American administration was the chance to move quickly and effectively and efficiently to contain it, as we used to do, as we did with Ebola and Zika and SARS-1 and so on. All of that went by the wayside. And that, unfortunately, is why we are today in the mess that we are. Now, I put all these thoughts down because I became so irritated, really, by the failure that has been the response to COVID. And I tried to say in the book that I wrote, Unmask the Politics of Pandemics, nature creates viruses, but politicians and politics, and I mean bad politicians and bad politics, create pandemics, and pandemics create new politics. And we've seen that work out in the last year. A year ago, the world was confronted with two ways of going. Either governments move swiftly and effectively to lock down, to stop the virus moving. It can only move as fast as people move and as far as people move. and to do all of those things that were behavioural change and did it quickly and effectively and efficiently, or we have a set of governments in the world led by the then American administration, by the United Kingdom government, by some in Europe, and regrettably, for a while, attractive here in Australia, in the early part of 2020, to basically deal with the virus, to let it in and let it run, and to move slowly, and the word proportionately, which is a terrible word when it comes to controlling viruses, see what happens. Well, of course, if you wait till that happens and see what happens, then it's out of control. Now, at the beginning of last year, there was a very big discussion in Australia between the way in which the federal government wanted to move, which was to let it in and let it run, which was derived from the United Kingdom response. Some of you will have seen the Swedish response, that it was a bit like flu, or was like flu. If you let it in and let it run, if you protected people in aged care, herd immunity would develop. This is just so much preposterous nonsense. There was no scientific grounds for claiming this to be so. People said that at the time, but nevertheless, that suited those who wanted to put to you this proposition that the choice was between protecting the economy or public health. That was what President Trump said. That was what was said in the United Kingdom. And that was the emerging view at some levels in Australia, that you could not put the economy at risk by locking down and doing the things that needed to be done. The person or the government that did do in our region, that did that, of course, China did that, Taiwan, Vietnam, and other countries in our region did do the right thing. They understood what was at stake and moved quickly. But Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand understood this really rapidly in January, February last year. And it was the response of the New Zealand government and the clarity with which they expressed what they were doing that really did start to make a difference in Australia over February and into March. The Australian government had not decided to stop the thing at the borders. In fact, border control was almost non-existent in February, March. While they shut down travel with China, they didn't shut down travel with the United Kingdom and the United States and Europe, which is where the virus came into Australia. That was never done. The cruise ships were not stopped till the 19th of March, and the thing started to emerge very rapidly in March. But Jacinda Ardern, New Zealand, had done it differently. That all came to a crunch on March the 22nd, when, to their great credit, the states and territories rejected the Commonwealth's approach and decided to send the country into lockdown. And it was that one decision that got us off the track that was being followed in the United Kingdom, the United States and Europe, and got us onto the track that was being followed pretty much in the Asian countries. And of course, we went through that. There were many ups and downs of Victoria and so on. But nevertheless, we opted for a local elimination strategy. And the point with local elimination is not to eradicate the virus. I mean, it's not eradication of the virus. And it's not to say you'll have no cases, but it means that you can eliminate and control through testing and tracing. You can eliminate local transmission. And with a lot of drama, as you'll all recall from through last year, that's what happened. And you do that, you do that until science can come up with something better. And goodness me, unbelievably, particularly for somebody who lived through the non-appearance of treatments, let alone vaccines in the HIV days, by about June last year, science came up with what seemed to be effective vaccines. That was a remarkable achievement, truly remarkable. So we had the problem, but local elimination, better days, and that started to come along, which has been tremendous. The American administration, who got everything wrong, did one big thing right, the end of last year, when they implemented what they call Operation Warp Speed, and they just threw untold amounts of money at the vaccine producers, and they delivered. That was the right thing to do. And we see the benefits of that now as the vaccines are being used to great effect around the world. So I guess we're at the end of the beginning, but we're nowhere near the beginning of the end of this thing. In Australia, we have a big problem. The federal government dropped the ball again. It did not secure enough supply, did not back all the horses in the race, and we have a terrible shortage of supply in Australia. Tonight, more than 90% of Australians are unvaccinated. At the borders, again, the quarantine system has not proved satisfactory. Hotels were never meant to be quarantine facilities, and the federal government has adamantly resisted the need to create, at scale, much more effective purpose-built quarantine facilities. These are two big problems, two big risks that we now face. And we face it in a world in which the number of new cases is exponentially growing. From the end of February, we had about 300,000-ish cases, a bit more per day in the world. Now it's the best part of 850,000 cases reported every day. And we've seen the catastrophe that has engulfed India, which is largely unvaccinated. And this is a real worry. So in the world, we have a rising problem. We have new variants. As Dr. Fauci said, the more it replicates, the more it can mutate. And that's what's happening. So more and dangerous variants are emerging in the world and at our borders. So we have to be good on quarantine and good on vaccination. So I hate to sound a bit depressing about all of these things, but I just think we've got to be realistic that we've done extremely well one way and another so far, but we've got to lock in those gains. We cannot allow this virus to come back into Australia. So the vaccine and quarantine are imperative. But internationally, we face a moment of truth. I think it's fair to say that the WHO, which is only in the end the expression of the interests of the member states, it doesn't have really a strong independent function of its own, has underperformed. The vaccination, the money going to vaccination is orders of magnitude less than what it needs to be. The demand in front of the world now is to vaccinate the world. The entire world must have access to vaccines, just as the entire world must have access to HIV treatments. That will require an immense amount of money to be generated by the developed countries to make sure that this happens, because until we are all out of it, none of us are out of it. So that must happen. We must look very closely at the better structures that can be developed internationally and nationally in Australia to give us the strongest possible chance of getting on top of COVID, but very importantly, to get on top of the next one, which can come tomorrow, as Bill Gates said back in 2015. Just because we've dealt with this one doesn't mean the next one's not coming. So we've got to build that. And importantly, a big step and very interesting step happens. Two things happen in this 24 hours. Tonight, the federal budget will be brought down. We will see if the Australian government reverses the extremely poor decisions it's taken since 2013 to slash Australia's development assistance. Australia has plunged down the rankings of the OECD. We have a budget of $4 billion for all of our ODA, which is just, it's derisory. However, Australia has been good on supporting vaccine-related initiatives, COVID and COVAX-related vaccine initiatives, which is good, but a lot more money. That's just a down payment. A lot more money has to come out of Australia to support the reconstruction of the international health system and vaccine support. And tomorrow, at midday Geneva time, the report of the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, co-chaired by Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, and Ma Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former President of Liberia, will come down. It's an extremely eminent panel that's been working diligently for 8 months to prepare this report about what could be done to strengthen the global architecture to respond to these things, and what really needs to be done now to make sure that the world is vaccinated. So we'll look forward to the recommendations of that report when it comes down in the next 24 hours, and to a good response out of the Australian government. And it is worth noting with Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, that really led the world in developed countries' response to COVID and greatly influenced us for the better in Australia. And Ma Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former President of Liberia, who was president when they had to deal with the really serious and shocking problems that emerged with Ebola. So the two co-chairs are people who know what they're talking about in practical political terms. And on that, let me conclude on that to say that as we go forward with this, we must learn a couple of very serious lessons. The world that got us into this mess, the structure of the world, the structure of our politics, the structure of the anti-science brigade who've predominated in the Western world for much of the last 10 or 20 years, but particularly under the previous American administration in the United Kingdom and in Australia. This has got to change. We are dealing with, we're not, as much as people would like to think we're dealing with a world about to go to war with nuclear weapons and China and all the rest of it, that's not the problem. The problem are little infinitesimal specks of viral particles and an infinitesimal speck of a carbon dioxide molecule. These are expressions of science, not politics. And we have got to deal with both of them because the future has arrived and it's not very pleasant. We must get on top of this question of pandemics, because then we can't go on like this manifestly. It's caused immense suffering and pain and disruption economically and health terms. And it's really a subset of the denial that we've seen in relation to climate change and global heating. And both of them are susceptible to policies based on science and evidence, but not policies based on economic self-interest and wishful thinking and pious hopes and platitudes of the sort that really have contributed to a very different world than it was 2 years ago. So the future has got to be better than it is. I think President Biden is leading the way in that, the American administration, but it's up to all of us in Australia, New Zealand and Asia to really seize back control of how we deal with these, what are really existential threats to our future. Ian and I are old enough to be saying sayonara, but you're not, and you really have an obligation and the opportunity to do something much better and build back a better world than the one that we left a year and a bit ago. Thank you.
You mentioned the very positive development of vaccines over recent months. Has the time now come, as business leaders are saying increasingly, to permit migration and entry to Australia to resume?
My view on this is vaccines first and borders second. A year ago, many of the business advisory groups, I'm not saying every business person in Australia, but many of the business advisory groups were peddling really nonsensical propositions that their economic interests should be put before protecting the public health of Australians. And they were saying, we need to do these things. My goodness, if you shut down movement and if you have masks and stop these things, we will be really badly affected, and that's not acceptable to us. And they fought to the last ditch to try to persuade the federal government and people in Australia that the public health would come second to their own economic interests. They were wrong. Thankfully, the premiers saw through the game, but the people who really figured it out were the people in the public health system. The great glory of Australia is the public health system. the hundreds of thousands of people who make that up. It's a great self-organising collective, but they got it right. They said, no, we will shut down the place. We will protect public health. And in doing so, we will protect the economy. So any suggestion now that you would let in large amounts of travellers from COVID endemic countries into a country that is 90% unvaccinated and has rickety, to say the best, quarantine facilities is kidding themselves. Vaccinate the population first entirely. That will help greatly. Build the quarantine facilities, and then bit by bit we can deal with some immigration, we can deal with students and so on and so forth. But it's a staged approach. The idea that you would open up the borders, let it in and let it run, was defeated a year ago. It was crazy public health policy. It was crazy economics, demonstrably. The economy is doing as well as it could be, thanks very much. And it would be crazy to listen to really the self-interested people who can see no further than their quarterly profit or their bonus and give them control of Australian public health.
Thanks.
And I say that in a nice possible way to any business people who are watching.
Any questions from the audience? Online?
Okay, we've got a question here from Sophia, and it's, thank you for such an excellent presentation. Did you expect a better response from European leaders? Are you concerned about the recent political outcome in the Madrid regional election?
Yes, the answer, I did. At the beginning a year ago, there was one standout disaster, and that was the United Kingdom. They were badly advised. They never closed their borders. They did nothing, and hundreds of thousands of people paid, 150, paid with their lives for the incompetence of the United Kingdom government and the policies they followed at the time. At the time, the European leaders, led by Chancellor Merkel and others, seemed to have grasped the key that you had to stop people moving and you had to control this movement. But unfortunately, before the last European summer, they fell to big domestic pressures. They didn't stop movement within Europe, and they let the Northern Europeans go to the South, which had been largely untouched by COVID to that stage, and that spread the problem around Europe. Then you get into this terrible, terrible dilemma. It becomes like a yo-yo. You suppress the caseload by a lockdown or doing something, masks and some behavioural changes, but you never eliminate it. And then when it goes down, you open up, and then it goes back up. And this yo-yo problem is really, understandably, I think, driving a lot of people in Europe nuts, because there is no easy way out of it. Of course, the only way really now that we have in Europe is by mass vaccination of everybody. So that's their big problem. So it's a lot more complex than it needed to have been. They ought to, in my view, have stopped movement when we did internally and locked down and eliminated it, and they decided not to. Now that creates a whole raft of new problems. In Madrid, which is a city I love, yes, that the mayor there decided not to shut down restaurants so much. And this was, of course, some of the Trump people in the United States in those states decided to do the same thing. But what will emerge is, if we're not careful, are the variants that will force these things to happen. We had a COVID last year that was at a certain level of infectivity and so on. But we're now getting these new variants that are far more infectious and problematical and really seriously affecting younger and younger cohorts. So the idea that it would only take out the oldies, or it was a lot of ado about nothing, I think is falling in face of the way in which the virus is replicating. So it's a concern.
online.
So we have a question here from Peter Campbell, and it's how do you see the situation in Sweden going forward?
People might recall that there are a couple of models put up a year ago about how to respond to this. One was the United States under the previous administration, and the other one was Sweden, where, thanks to the vagaries of their internal political arrangements, the director of the Public Health Authority in Sweden is totally autonomous virtually from the government. And they opted for what they called herd immunity. And this was also the UK approach, said you could somehow stop the virus getting into aged care where people would be more vulnerable. But if you let it run in the community, it wouldn't be that problematical. Well, that went on for months and months as the alternative. It was held to be by some commentators and academics in Australia as being the way we ought to have gone, and not the New Zealand way, or not the way in which we developed in Australia. And that would be all to the best. Well, anybody who looks at the current figures in Sweden knows that it's not worked. Let's be completely clear. They have a worse outcome in health terms than the neighbouring states, Scandinavian states. Travel is restricted from them. And of course, their economic results have been shocking. It was so bad that towards the end of last year, the King of Sweden did the right thing and apologised to the Swedish people for the failure of Swedish policy. But I'm no expert on Swedish politics, but it's astonishing to me that the people who delivered this outcome to the people of Sweden are still in office and still able to implement policies that are so manifestly failed.
Thanks very much for your talk. I was wondering if you give any weight, considering Australia has seemingly suppressed case numbers to near zero and has a relatively effective quarantine system, to the idea that we ought to share more of our vaccine resources with countries, developing countries perhaps in the region, who have much higher case numbers than we do currently.
Yes, that's a very good point, and the ethics of it and the requirements really need to be thought through. Yes, we have a serious problem in Papua New Guinea, and a lot more vaccines have to go there. And it's been good that the government, the Morrison government, has recognised that and has supported the allocation of vaccines into Papua New Guinea and other Pacific countries where there is a problem. But Papua New Guinea, I think, is the big one. I think we'll have to look very closely at the at the independent panel report tomorrow, because that question of vaccine access and equity and not vaccine nationalism is really going to drive things in the next year. The world must produce more vaccines of all sorts, and those vaccines must be equitably and properly distributed between countries like Australia that, as you say, have things under control at the moment, but countries that don't. And you couldn't have a worse or more sobering example, and our hearts go out to the Indian people than India. India is less than 2% vaccinated. The government there decided that they had somehow got on top of it. They became complacent, but vaccines must be, India must be vaccinated. I mean, it's a huge country, but that's the same with everywhere. So this is a very thorny problem, but we've got to allocate. The greatest vaccine of all is money. So the money will generate the vaccines, and then the money has got to generate the distribution mechanisms in these countries. We're very fortunate in Australia. We have a wonderful public health system run by the most wonderful and exceptional people. And really, you can be critical at the edge of it, and say, why didn't this happen, and so on. But generally, it's been phenomenally good, wonderfully good. So we're in a good position compared to Papua New Guinea or India or the Philippines or Myanmar, for example, and we've got to figure out ways in which we can get great quantities of vaccine distributed in those countries so that those people can be better protected.
Question online.
Yep, so we have a question here from John West, and it's how should Australia hedge against the possibility of the Republicans taking control of the Congress in 2 years' time and maybe retaking the presidency in 4 years' time?
I wish, it's a bit beyond my pay grade, really, I think, about, look, I say this about America, and I learnt this the hard way in HIV days. America is this remarkable country that has the best and the worst of humanity within it. And we see this terrible contest between the good and the bad. Let's be frank. And the world can rightly point the finger at the previous administration, who made a bad problem, a serious problem, a lot worse last year. And convinced a lot of people in the United States that science didn't apply, that the thing was a hoax, and that there was a political way out of it by not wearing masks and all that stuff. And it's been shocking. It's influenced the rest of the world and influenced people in Australia, but also in Europe and elsewhere, and Brazil. So that's the poor side of it. The good side of it are people like President Biden and Dr. Fauci and the people who now have got control of American policymaking and are really trying to do something remarkably good in relation to their economic reconstruction, but also to the production of vaccines. President Biden has more than delivered on the promise of his first 100 days. You know, the 140 million people have got the vaccine. In fact, they're coming to the limits of the people who want the vaccine, who can have it. They've got some places a bit of a surplus. So that's tremendous. And American productive capacity is so great. You know, the capacity of America to produce these things is enormous. So they, on balance, they're far better than worse. So you'd hope that politically in the United States, they would recognise the great work that has been done by the Biden administration. But as a small country in the rest of the world, as we learned in the HIV days, if they go bad, they'll go real bad real fast. So we rejected the American model under the Reagan people in the 1980s, and that saved a lot of lives and distress and horror in Australia. And I'm sure that if, hopefully not, but if things went bad again there because of their politics, then Australia would have made sure we don't follow them down the rabbit hole.
We have a question from here in the room, Sanjay.
Thank you so much for your remarks tonight. Much has been made of the Australian government's decision to ban Australian citizens caught up in the situation in India from returning home. One of the natural consequences of this would be some of those individuals looking to remove themselves from that situation and move to other countries in the region, perhaps who don't have the same case numbers as India. So I guess my question is, and raising the risks in those countries of a further COVID outbreak. So my question is, what do you make of the efficacy and the morality of Australia outsourcing its quarantining of Australian citizens?
It's a good question. Well, right at the beginning, I believe strongly all Australian citizens have, if not a constitutional or a legal right to return, they have a moral right to return. Anybody who has an Australian passport can return to Australia without threat of being jailed or fined for having the temerity to be a citizen of Australia. So that's number one. Secondly, of course, if people are coming from India, where you have this dreadful problem, we should have spent a lot more time in the last year building the quarantine facilities of such a standard that would allow those people to come back in the requisite numbers. I think there are 9,000 or so citizens who would like to return or want to return, and 170, 80 unaccompanied children. So all of that to me is just straightforward. We can do that. And certainly the question of third-party destinations and so on, is extremely important. It's not been commented on a great deal, but the situation in the Gulf and Dubai for the last year, I think, is a matter of great concern. Dubai, for its own reasons, decided to allow transit of people, kept open, and clearly that's assisted in the spread of COVID in and out of Dubai. So I think we're coming under a lot of pressure. But I think on this question of India and Australians, we've got to really work hard now to return people who want to come back. The stranded Australians, I think it's a shocking situation, but it is created by the fact that the Australian government deliberately did not expand quality quarantine facilities over the last year. So that should change, both in the interest of the people who are coming back, obviously, and who need proper care and attention and treatment for the quarantine period, and certainly for the interests of the Australian people. We don't want to prejudice our present situation.
How are we going for online questions?
Yep, so we've got a question here from Manny Kingsley, and it's, why have governments promoted the interest of a small economic elite over the public good? For example, maintaining private control over the mass production of vaccines.
Funnily enough, the question of the pharma companies and so on was something that was deeply argued at the time of HIV and AIDS. It's true that after the war, many countries, including Australia, had nationally owned, government-owned vaccine production. In Australia in the 80s, we had the Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, which were Commonwealth instrumentality, and they were extremely important at that time in bringing in experimental treatments from the United States, and the CSL laboratories produced them, and we were able to use them in Australia to great effect. And then successive governments under neoliberal orthodoxy decided that the best thing to do was to sell these national facilities. Over time in Australia, the capacity of Australia to manufacture vaccines was offshored, because that suited the interests of the big pharmaceutical manufacturers, that suited the interests of the shareholders and the corporations that we had established. But it leaves us in a really invidious position. We have virtually no capacity in Australia to manufacture at scale mRNA vaccines. We have none. We decided not to do that. And it has taken CSL, the private CSL that replaced the previous public one, it took them months to ramp up the production of AstraZeneca. So there's a big consequence to being part of the globalised neoliberal operation. We lose a lot of capacity to manufacture strategic products in our own interest in this country. And I think if we take away one lesson from all of this, it is that there are certain things that we should manufacture here, and that is good for the pandemics as they come along, but it's tremendously important in creating a generation of scientists and researchers and business people and so on in Australia producing these vaccines and equipment here. That's in our national interest to do it, and I think we've got to return to that now.
We have time for one more question. We have one. Yes.
We've got one more. This is from Vivian Chordy. And the question is, what is your opinion of a viable pathway to cross-border movements when the Prime Minister has inferred that even if the majority of Australians were to be vaccinated, that appetite for border closures would remain indefinitely? Do you worry about the psychosocial effect this would have in isolating so many Australians with family and friends overseas, not to mention growing nationalistic isolation, feeding a populist narrative?
Yeah, it's a serious point. I think we're going to have to, as much as I personally don't like this, but we are stuck with COVID in the world. Not necessarily in Australia, but we're stuck with it in the world for the foreseeable future. So the question is going to arise of how do we deal with people who, for every sort of reason, wish to travel, see my sister has her granddaughter hasn't seen her in 2 years. They live in Liverpool, United Kingdom. I don't know, my sister would very much like to see my granddaughter, the new granddaughter. And funerals and all the sorts of things that happen in people's lives and business. We've got to do, we're going to have to come to terms with that. All I can say is really that, in my view, the way in which we as Australians can best deal with that is vaccinating everybody now and getting ourselves organised around vaccine and quarantine. If we can do that, then we can deal with the question of borders and travel. That's putting the horse before the cart. We can figure this out and deal with it. And the quicker we deal with the vaccine and quarantine issues, then the sooner we can get on with coming to terms with a world in which COVID is a continuing phenomenon and is not going to go away as we would have hoped that it would. But this requires a serious, open, honest, frank discussion and debate in the Parliament with the people. None of this coming to decisions behind closed doors within the national security operations of the Cabinet, where everything is kept secret, and coming up with policies that are half-baked often, that don't represent the interests of the Australian people or the public health interest. So the way through this in the days of HIV and now is for openness and honesty, truth and transparency. We're not dealing in a world where COVID is going away, but we do have an enviable position to protect in Australia. So we have to try to figure out how to reconcile those two problems. And as I say, I think the way to do that is to vaccinate everybody now, not let it drag on, not to have variable vaccine arrangements for the people who've been vaccinated who want to go and travel to the south of France, as if that's in our interest to do that, but can deal with the very real questions of opening the borders, but after we do the vaccine and after we have much, much better quarantine arrangements in place.
Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. Next week, we'll be putting out a further edition of Columns from Glover Cottages. And our next live event will be here on Tuesday, the 25th of May. That will be our interns debate. They're going to discuss the effect of American climate change policy under President Biden on Australian climate change policy. But to conclude our event tonight, one of our interns, Alice Nason, will move a vote of thanks to our speaker.
On behalf of the Institute, I would like to thank Professor Boughton for addressing us tonight on COVID. Of course, it has been all we've thought about as an international community over the past year and a half. And between Australia's lethargic vaccine rollout and exponential growth in vaccine COVID cases abroad, it's clear, as you've said, that we're stuck with it. Drawing on your experience of the Australian HIV response, you've taught us really important lessons tonight about the necessity of a creative public health response based on trust and scientific expertise. Heeding your lessons from this experience, we hope that in future Australia builds resilience within its public health infrastructure to take comprehensive, coordinated and bipartisan responses to pandemics. Beyond the national response, I was also moved by your approach to the international element of this crisis, as none of us are out of it until we all are. Over the next year, vaccine equity, an investment in international development in vaccine distribution, a functioning WHO, and American leadership are all required for a efficient vaccine rollout. Long term, I hope that Australia and the world heeds your lesson not to politicize a problem of science, not doing this behind closed doors, and prioritizing public health transparency above other matters to build back better. Thank you.
Thank you.